Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Arriving here in the snow reminded me of a great Peanuts cartoon in which Charlie Brown is amassing great masses of snowballs. He's up on a hill, and he's ready for Lucy, and Lucy comes around the corner and spots him and says, "Charlie Brown, don't you dare throw any of those snowballs or there will be dire consequences." And the last frame has Charlie Brown saying, "That's the trouble with life," he says. He says, "You have all of these options, but you never get to choose one." And of course, that is a story of U.S. policy in the Middle East for the last 20 or so years. And the question is whether or not we get to choose one. Last April, I visited with former President Carter Sedrat and Ashkelon, and we saw the rockets and the impact of the rockets. And how they really terrorized the whole community, and the traumatic effect it had on the people. And the people were very clear in our meetings with them that they were frustrated with their own government, which neither took military action to stop the rockets, nor effective diplomacy to do that. And last July I visited Gaza. I requested it for the 4 previous visits, but that was the first one that Israel allowed me to visit. And I saw the impact of the siege on Gaza and the impact of a full blockade. Some of us talk about embargoes with regard to Cuba, but Cuba still can trade with 125 nations in the world. And, of course, Gaza cannot. It is shut off. And I think it was clear to Carter and it's clear to me that Israel does have the right to defend itself against the rockets, and that Gazans have a right to have that siege lifted. And therefore the question is, how do you get to a point in which both rights are respected? Obviously, on December 27th, the Israeli government determined the only way to do that was by a massive invasion of Gaza. What are the results? At least 1,300 people died. Perhaps a majority were not just civilians, but women and children. Another 5,500 or 5,600 people injured. 4,000 to 5,000 homes destroyed. 20,000 homes damaged. You had the attack on the American International School and 3 other schools, 50 UN facilities, mosques, the Palestinian Legislative Council, most of the ministries. It was devastating. And I think the question really is twofold. One, what else was accomplished? And was there another alternative? I think in trying to understand what else was accomplished, as you both know, both Hamas and Israel declared victory after the invasion. It's an absurd declaration on both parts, given that kind of devastation, and shows just how they live in such different planets from each other, and different planets from any of us who can look and see that this was no success for anyone. But the hard part is in determining what the criteria were, what the objectives were of each side. Hamas, in effect, could declare victory if their sole objective was survival. But what about Israel? What were their objectives? We never did receive a very clear statement of objectives from Israel. If you read the papers, there may have been one of 3 different objectives. The first objective seemed obvious, which was to stop the rockets. But the interesting thing is that the rockets never did stop during the invasion. They only stopped after the invasion and as Israel was pulling out on a unilateral basis on the part of Hamas. Another objective may have been to cripple Hamas and to cripple their command and control. But interestingly enough, just as Israel departed, that same command and control reasserted itself in the streets. Indeed, I frankly had expected that would have been disrupted and that we would have seen the emergence of 12 new militant groups, of which Hamas would have difficulty asserting itself. And indeed, in that sense, it would have been an irony from the Israeli perspective and Yesterday, Defense Minister Ehud Barak confirmed the convolution of that irony when he said, we see Hamas as responsible for everything that happens in Gaza. That's a quote. That's a quote. Now, that's a fascinating statement that his second objective obviously was not only a failure, but it's not really his objective. That, in effect, he realizes that if there is going to be an effective ceasefire, Hamas needs to be in control. The third objective was the extermination of Hamas. Now, you never heard that from the government, and that is a horrific statement, obviously, for a country that was born of the Holocaust to even make such an assertion. Hamas clearly is a movement, it's a party, but it's also rooted in Gaza and in the West Bank. Whether it's a minority or a majority remains to be seen for the next election, but it clearly cannot be exterminated. So that should be ruled out. So the question returns, what was the objective? It's not clear of Israel. And the more important question is, was there an alternative? And the answer is, yes, there was an alternative. And indeed, we saw that the alternative was working for Israel, but it wasn't working for Hamas, and that's why the rockets started again. In April, when former President Carter met with Khalid Mashal in Damascus, and he met with the Gaza leadership in Cairo, and he met with the West Bank leadership of Hamas in Ramallah. We pressed Hamas very hard on a number of different positions. The first was a unilateral ceasefire, and they insisted that they could not do it unilaterally, that it had to be reciprocal. The second one was some acceptance of Israel, and they did agree after a Politburo meeting 3 days after we left, and sent a written statement to Carter, which Carter read in Jerusalem and informed the Israeli government and the world of it as well, that they would accept any final status agreement negotiated between the Palestinian Authority and Israel, provided that was approved in a referendum, a free referendum, which they asked the Carter Center and other international observers to affirm its fairness, or by a new national unity government that was accepted. So what did that mean? What did that statement mean? That statement meant, in effect, they would accept Israel as part of an agreement, because we know once you reach a final status agreement, the preamble will have a mutual recognition. Israel will recognize an independent Palestinian state, and the Palestinian state will recognize Israel. So while Hamas could not quite bring itself to say we recognize Israel, it views that as a critical coin for a bargain in a pocket that has very few other coins. In effect, it said we will accept Israel by that statement. More significant from the short term was that at that moment there had been many talks between Israel and Hamas indirectly through Egypt that was trying to mediate a ceasefire. At that point, Israel insisted that the ceasefire would apply only to Gaza, and Hamas insisted that it applied to the West Bank as well. I think President Carter was able to persuade Mashal and Hamas to accept it only to apply to Gaza, and therefore to close the deal. This was on April 21st. It still took 2 more months for Israel to accept that deal, but that deal came into effect on June 19th. And on June 19th, the agreement was that the rockets would stop at 6 a.m. on June 19th. Within 3 days, 30% of the trucks that had gone into Gaza prior to the siege in early 2007 would begin to come into Gaza. And 10 days after that, that is to say 13 days after June 19th, 100% of the trucks, which was at a level of 750 trucks a day, would be permitted to go into Gaza. I met with Khania in Gaza in July.